So now we're on Daf Lamed Hey Owen Beis. Hachishev be'emurim nispalgu emurim atzma. Right? You misinterpreted this brisa and jumped to the conclusion that this brisa is supporting Rabbi Elazar. It's not supporting Rabbi Elazar. All the brisa is telling you is that in a case where he had a full-fledged machshavas pigul on the emurim, right, the emurim that should be burnt on the mizbech nektarim should be burnt liachar zmanom on the next day. Nispaglu haimurim atzmam. The heft of Iser Pigul with the Chiv Kares is only chal on the emurim themselves, not on the parts of the animal which are burnt, the basa that's burnt outside of Yishalayim. Toshma, another opportunity to support Rabbi Elazar from a Mishnah. Okay, now we're going to learn a little bit about Me'ilah, and Me'ilah applies when you magdish an animal lemizbeach, that's called kedushas haguf, but it's not yet kedushas karban. Only after the shechita it gets kedushas karban. But anyway, in stage one it has kedushas haguf, and once kedushas haguf is chal, then there's a parsha of me'ilah. Me'ilah means if you misappropriate it and use it for your own purposes to benefit from it, then you're chayav to add a chomesh when you pay back the hegdesh, and you have to bring a karban me'ilah. So param and israfim, usirim and asrafim, right? We have param and seirim that sometimes are burnt outside the migdash. And the truth is, we should go through a whole list of them. It's Paralem Dovashal Tzibur and Parashal Kohen Gadol, and one or two others. Anyway, Molin Bahemishahuk, the Shud Me'ilah is generated at the very moment that you are Magdish it, even though at that stage it only has Kedushas Haguf. And Nishketu, once the Shechita takes place, now it's upgraded to Kedushas Karban. And therefore, Hukshuli Pasel Bitful Yom, Kapar Believe. So now all the regular standard psulim will kick in because it now has Kedushas Karban. What psulim do we have in Karban? Number one, we have a Tful Yom, who again, as we said many times, he has gone to the mikveh, but he has to wait for Erev Shemesh, so his Tara process is not yet complete. Then we have Mechusa Kapara, which is the Zav Yoledes Mitzorah, that have counted all the days of Nikiyim, and the purification process is lacking in one last, I call it Makav Patch, to bring their korbanos on the 8th day. And these Mechusei Kapara will now be puzzled. Right, until he brings his kapara. Okay, he doesn't add anything here in the footnote. Ubelina, right? And if there's parts of the animal that need haktorah, you can't leave it over to the following night. I mean, to the following day. That's called lina. So once the carbon gets its second stage kedusha, meaning kedusha's carbon, then we start counting the psul of lina if he leaves it over from that point overnight. Now, when it says lina, we don't know if the lina here is referring to the part of the nisrafim that's burnt on the mizbeach, which is called the mitan laktorah. My love, maybe it doesn't refer to that. It refers to the basa. In other words, he kept the basa or the par or the soyer overnight. But how could that be? What psul of lina would be chal? Shmamino nigo de pasla belina pasla ba machshava. The Mishnah is teaching me that to the same extent that if he leaves the meat overnight, there's a psul of lina, so too if he has a machshava about the meat that it should be left overnight, which means chutz l'zmano, right? There's an absolute equation here between lina and pigul. They're both chutz l'zmano. The lina means it was left overnight, chutz l'zmano, and machshavas pigul means the machshava was chutz l'zmano. And if we're saying that there's a psul of lina, then by virtue of that analogy, there should likewise be a psul of pigul, a machshavas pigul. Now, how could you have a psul of machshavas pigul in the case of the basar, the par? It's not a nechal, and it's not a niktar. The answer could only be that we apply and activate the principle of Elazar that once pigul is chal on the part that's niktar or the part that's nechal, which again doesn't apply here in the case of seirim and israfim, then the entire animal is included in pigul. And the Gemara says, "Lo, that's not what the Mishnah is referring to, but rather linas emurim." The Mishnah is saying that the basar of the par would never become pigul, but the psul of lina is chal only on those emurim that are niktarim al gabi mizbeach. Affecting Gemara, but you have to be consistent in the Reisha and the Sefer. What does it say in the Sefer? In Iktani Sefer, it says kula mol bahem al beis hadeshen ad sheyutach habasa. Okay, there's a lot going on over here. Let's see if I could sort of summarize it in as quickly as I possibly can without losing the meaning of what's going on over here. Let me start from the bottom. Ad sheyutach. What does ad sheyutach mean? So normally I thought yutach means to melt something down, like you have a metal and you do hatocha. But that's not what the word yutach means over here. There are two different stages of sreifa, of burning something. At stage number one, there's like a kind of a surface level sreifa. Have you ever taken a piece of bread, let's say, on Erev Pesach, right? You take a piece of bread, you put it in the fire. You'll notice that like the fire goes up, but if you would cut the piece of bread open, you'd still find bread inside. So that's like a surface level of burning. But that's not the mitzvah of sreifa. When the Torah commands us to do sreifa, it's ad sheyutach. Yutach means it's got to be a total sreifa. Yutach here means that it's burned through and through. Again, there's some shirayim left of the original substance, but basically it's really, really burnt. Ad sheyutach. Now, with regard to me'ilah, you can analyze what I call hafkas me'ilah. When does me'ilah terminate? In one of two different ways. You can either say that Batla Shem Ochel, it's no longer edible. Or you could say Nases Mitzvos, that the Hafkah of Me'ilah would apply even if it's still somewhat edible, but because you did what you had to do, you fulfilled your mitzvah. Nases Mitzvos, as a Sugim Psachim, removes Me'ilah. So what's going on over here is that when the Seirim and the Parim are burnt outside of the Mikdash, they're brought to something called the Beis Hadeshen, which is where they took all the ashes from the Mizbeach, and they place the meat on these ashes. And ad sheyutach means when it's a serious fire, even though it's still edible. But ad sheyutach is a shear in nases mitzvah. So the mitzvah was fulfilled, and that's going to remove and undermine the isur me'ilah. Michlal, the reisha linas basar. The whole discussion here in the Sefer is about the basar. That you took the basar outside, you put it on the Beis Hadeshen, and at what point are you mafkia? Do you terminate me'ilah? So if the Sefer is talking about basar, then the Reisha should likewise talk about basar. And just like there's a psul lina in the basar, if you leave it overnight, so too is a psul of pigul of a machshava of chutzes mano with regard to the meat of the bull. And that again would support Rabbi Lazar that once he has a machshavas pigul on the murim, which is a full-fledged generation of generates pigul, then the pigul and the isakaris is chal even on the basar. And the Gemara says no. Midei iri, don't bring a proof from the Sefer to the Reisha, ha-kedisa, ha-kedisa. Reisha murim, a Sefer basar. The Sefer is talking about Me'ilah on the basar, which was taken out, and the Reish is talking about Emurim. And the Isser Pigel is only Chal on the Emurim, and we have here the Gemara playing the devil's advocate against Rabbi Loz. But Mosiv Rabbah, now that you've already rejected any proof to support Rabbi Loz, now the Gemara is going to say in the name of Rabbah, let's reject Rabbi Loz from the following. The Brisa says, V'elu she'ein mefaglim ve'ein mispaglim. And now we have a whole list of things that are not subject to generate pigul if he had a machshavas chutzes mano. And not only that, they're not mispagil. They never receive a chal shem pigul, even if he had a full-fledged machshavas pigul. For example, semish rosh hakvasim. Oh, so there's wool on the head of the lamb, and there's seir shebezoket hayoshim, and the goats, the young goats have hairy beards, and ha'or, or the hide, or the rotev, a kippah, olol, mura, atzamos, gidin, karnayim, tlofim, shlil, shilia, all of these that we discussed already, chalav hamukdashim, beitzei torim, right, the milk, or the eggs, in the case of the birds, bekulan lo mefaglin, v'lo mispaglin. Ben chayovin alehem mishum pigul. Pigul number 1, nosar number 2, tummy number 3. Here we have a brisa that's almost black and white against Rabbi Loza, because all these things, not only are they ein mefaglin, but they're also ein mispaglin, which means they could never be a chalos iser pigul with an iser kores in these objects. But that's not true according to Rabbi Loza. My love, lo mefaglim hazevach, lo mispaglim machmas hazevach. Beautiful. Lo mispaglim machmas hazevach. The simple reading of this brisa would indicate that even if there was a pigul, nevertheless these objects on this entire list would not be mispagil. They don't have the capacity of becoming pigul. That's against Rabbi Loza. Lo, Kumar says that's not a proof against Rabbi Loza. Lo mefaglim es hazevach, v'lo mispaglim machmas atzma. A little bit of a dochak that tries to push in that they could never become pigul if the machshava was about them. So if you had a machshava chutzes mano about the, the tzemer, this, and the seir that, and the or this, and the kippah, and so forth and so on, that would not generate pigul. Ihachi, says the Gemara, hadik tani seifa, kulam lo mefaglam mispaglim hasu lamali. There's a whole sentence in this price that's totally superfluous and unnecessary. It's simply a repeat performance. It says kulam lo mefaglim v'lo mispaglim, and the reason why the Brisa repeats this is lafuke Rabbi Loza, to show you that it would never become pigul. So the Gemara says, wait a minute, and you think you're out in the clear? I'm going to prove to you that the Brisa has a sentence that's superfluous and unnecessary, even according to you, even if you reject Rabbi Loza. Why? Because it says, the next part of the Brisa says, ein chayovin alev mishum pigul hasu lamal. You've already told me in the Reisha that you could never be chayav for pigul if you eat any of the above. So why does it say again a repetition? Ein chayovin alev mishum pigul. Ella, you're going to have to come up with the ID detani. ID deboy lemisnei no sarvitame tana pigul. He wants to tell you a chiddush about nosar and tamei, so he throws in pigul. Hachinami here too. ID deboy lemisnei hamala behen bachutz tananami v'kul lo mefaglim v'lo mispaglim. But again, they could become pigul if there was a bona fide meleches pigul, machshavas pigul. Rafa Omer afanan nami tnina. I'm going to prove from our Mishnah here to support Rabbi Lazar's ruling. Ashochet es hamukdashim, if he shechts the animal, the korban, lechol shliya lo shliya b'chutz lo piga, right? Because a machshavas shliya lo shliya or shliya doesn't generate pigul. Hamal because I told lechol beitzei b'chutz lo pigul. V'hadar tani, and then the Mishnah says chalev hamukdashim ubeitzei torim ein chayav and aleh mishum pigul no savitame. All of a sudden, when it gets to the sefer of the Mishnah focuses exclusively on chalav and beitzim. Well, you dropped the ball over here. Why didn't you talk about shlil v'shilya? The implication is that in shlil v'shilya, since it's part of the karban, therefore chayav it would become pigul. Elav shmami, no, we have here a conclusion to support Rabbi Loza, kan machmas hazevach, kan machmas atzma. Shmami no. Tonight in Hos we learned in the Mishnah, Bale Mumin. Okay, now we're getting into a whole another discussion. And this has to do with im olu lo yerdu. You may remember that concept that the Mizbeach is Makadesh, even something that's possible. And once it's taken up onto the Mizbeach for Sreifa for Aktorah, we don't take it down, we're going to burn it. But there's a machlokas between the Rabbanon and Rabbi Akiva about balmum. If, let's say, the animal that was brought as a korban was a balmum, it has a blemish, then the Chachamim say that balimumin im olu yerdu, meaning that the Chachamim say that this is already going too far. You can't say that the Mizbeach could be makadesh, something that can't become a korban. A balmum can never become a korban. But Rabbi Akiva machshir b'balimumin. Rabbi Akiva went as far as to say that im olu lo yerdu, even in the case of balmum, and the mizbeach is makadesh the balmum, and once it was brought up on the mizbeach, then you machter. Omer Rabbi Chia bar Abba Rabbi Yochanan lo hichshir Rabbi Akiva el bedukin sheba'ayin holu ksherim bi'ofos. When does Rabbi Akiva say that the Mizbeach has the capacity to be Magdish, to be Makadesh, I should say? That's only on something that somewhere in the entire constellation of Kodshim could be brought on the Mizbeach. Now, where do you have a case of a balmum, of a blemish in some part of the animal that still could be valid for the Mizbeach? That's only the case of cataracts in the eye, because the eye closes and you don't see it, so it's not an obvious mum. And in that case, Rabbi Akiva holds that in general, if you take a balmum up to the Mizbeach lo yard, because there's one case where a balmum is kosher for Mizbeach, hol kshem be ofos. Oh, so this case of cataracts in the eye only applies to ofos. Okay. Right now, I don't understand exactly why the oath is different. Just 1 second, maybe he says it here. Okay, I don't know. He just says here in the note that a bird offering with a cataract is valid. And therefore, in another case of an animal that's a balmum, the Mizbeach is Mekadesh, according to Rabbi Akiva. Oh. Now we have a further limitation of Rabbi Akiva, who shekodam hikdishas muma. It became a balmum after he was magdish it. If he was magdish it at the time that it already was a balmum, that ma'aseh hekdesh is not chal, it doesn't register, and even Rabbi Akiva would hold him olu yered. Fi Omar Rab Chia bar Abba umoder Rabbi Akiva bi olas nekeva Now, wait a second. What happens? An ola can only be brought from a zachar, from a male animal, not from an akeva. He was magdish in akeva as a korban ola. Says Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Akiva would agree in this case that him olu yerdu. Why? Because the mum predates the hakdasha. I mean, the animal was born female. The commander kodem muma like they should done. Moser Rab Zera hamala mehen bachutz potter. If he brings up a korban, mayhem is referring to that case of a shilya, and he brought it up on a mizbech outside of the mikdash, which is called shchutei chutz. He's pot. Right. Because since a shilya could never be brought as a korban, therefore there's no Isser of shchutei chutz. Shchutei chutz means he could have brought it in the mikdash, and instead he brought it outside the mikdash. So now the Gemara makes a deal. Hame iman chaya. Right? You're talking about a shilya, but the implication is that if it would have been the mother, right, the actual zevach, then he would be chayav. Now we're talking about a female. How could you have a case of a female that could be brought on the mizbeach, be olas nekeva? So if it's a case of an olas nekeva, then apparently the reason why you chayav for chutz is because it's royal ifnim. And even though an ola could only be brought from a zachar, not from a female, apparently we're holding that this is a case of a balmum so it's not kadma hekdesh lamuma. Why isn't it kadma hekdesh lamuma? He's saying the following, that since a female animal is royal mizbeach, not in the case of ola, but in the case of shlomim or in the case of chatos, therefore, according to Rabbi Kiva's logic, it lends itself to the principle of him olu lo yerdu. So there is a possibility in this female of a nekevas chatos, ola, that it could be, so to speak, brought on the mizbeach, not the ola, but in the case of chatos and shlomim. Because of Rabbi Akiva. Olas nekevim also lo yered. If you're going to hold, the Rabbi Akiva holds that even in the case of an ola that was a female animal, then the mizbech is mekadesh. Then Hamani, we can justify this brisa by saying that this brisa is to be attributed to Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that even in the case of olas nekevim also lo yered. And the reason for that again is because it could be brought as a korban chatos or a korban shlomim. Also tered, if you're going to say the way you said it, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, that Rabbi Akiva is modeh, that even that im ola tered. Why? Because it's kadma muma it's what? It's kadma muma lehekdesha, because it was born a female, is hamani. This price doesn't make any sense. No one would say him alu lo yerdu. So how could it be a chiyuv of chutz? There can't be a chiyuv of chutz unless it's roy bifnim, and it's only roy bifnim if it's in alu lo yerdu, which itself is interesting. So Gemara says, "Ema hamala mehen bachutz potu." Don't be medayik that the iman itself is chayav. She's a female, and Rabbi Akiva would be modeh that it's kadma hekdesha limuma, and therefore there's no din of him olu. The din would be faket that him olu yerdu. But rather, the discussion in the brisa is about the emurim. That has nothing to do with Rav Chiya bar Abba. Let's just see if we can get up to the Mishnah, and I apologize for going overtime. Vaha mehen katani, right? The language of the brisa seems to be mehen, referring to the shilya, and the shilya is basar. The shilya is not emurim. The iman dum yedidu, and therefore we should assume that iman is like the shilya and referring to the basar. Ella ema. So the Gemara says now we have to reinterpret the brisa. Hamala me'imureim b'chutz patur, hame'imurei iman chayav. If he brought these parts, let's say a shilya, a fetus, outside of the migdash, but it was a murim, is then he's patur. Why? Because the fetus is not niktar al gabi mizbeach. The shilya does. So therefore, if it's not niktar, then there's no chutz. Hame murei iman chayav. If he brought that same emurim of the mother, which emurim is designated to be burnt on the mizbeach, not like shilya, then he be chayav for chutz. Okay, then. So we'll stop here at the Mishnah, and we'll continue Mitzvah Hashem tomorrow. Thank you so much. Have a great day.